Welcome to our special edition of the impact of the coronavirus on South Seattle and surrounding communities. It's me, Tony B, and we have another group of folks who will be here to tell you about how the coronavirus is impacting what they do and how they do it. Thank you for joining us again. And we'll be starting off with Kris Hermanns from the Seattle Foundation, and we'll be following that up with a conversation with Carolyn Bick, a journalist from the South Seattle Emerald, who essentially broke a story about the testing center that's going to be opening in the Rainier Beach area. We'll talk a little about that. We're also going to talk to Glenn Turner, who is the executive director of the Emergency Feeding Program, and find out how the coronavirus has impacted what they're doing and what they've been doing in response to the increased need. And then also later on in the program, we'll be joined by a representative from, Praise Alleluia. So what Praise Alleluia is an organization that works with those who have addictions. It's a recovery center. And we're going to talk about how the coronavirus has impacted the work that they do and what they do as well. Right now, I believe I have Kris Hermanns from the Seattle Foundation on the line. Kris, are you here with me?
Indeed, I am, Tony. Thanks for having me on today.
Awesome, Kris. Thank you for being here, and excited to be able to talk to you. Why don't we start off, Kris, for those who may not know, with an explanation about the Seattle Foundation, who you are, what you do, and just kind of your place in the world before the coronavirus.
Sure. We like to think of Seattle Foundation as being the region, the community's community foundation. And what we aim to do is try to ignite rewarding and powerful philanthropy so that we're supporting our community to make it stronger and more vibrant and thriving for everyone. And we do that through grant making, convenings, policy advocacy work, very broad set of tools and resources we use. And mostly we're just trying to advance equity and shared prosperity and belonging throughout the region, while we're also really helping to strengthen the impact individual and institutional philanthropists are having across the region. And next year we celebrate our 75th anniversary, and really have been trying to do and pursue all of this work in deep community partnership with folks like yourself and others on the South Side, and then also in terms of our civic leadership, our advising, and stewarding the financial resources that people trust us with.
Thank you. As we're explaining this to folks, there are what we'll just call major donors who do want to donate, and they rely on organizations like yours, and you correct me if I'm wrong, to help them when they're not exactly sure who or what they want to donate to, but they want to make sure that it goes to a resource that's going to provide whatever is needed that they're thinking about doing. And so you kind of help, is that correct, when folks want to donate large amounts of money? Help it get to the place that it needs to go.
A whole range, yeah, absolutely. I think mostly it's to try to serve as a bridge. It's a bridge, because we've been around and listening and partnering in community for a long time. We have a special, we've been given special vantage point to be able to help philanthropists who may not know certain issues, know certain organizations, familiar with different neighborhoods, to lift up the incredible leadership in the organizations that are doing the work on the front lines and on the ground. And so we try to bridge that by creating different ways for a range of both individuals, families, and institutions, philanthropists, to be able to make those kind of investments where it's needed most.
And because what is happening right now, at least from my perspective, is there is a lot of giving. There are a lot of folks who are making donations, and under the circumstances that we're in right now, again, we hear about money coming from government and money and how it will get to where it needs to go and what these processes are. So I think for a lot of folks, this is now on the forefront, whereas before it might not have been something that people thought about very much. But just recently, in that regard, we've heard about small businesses who haven't received money that they thought they were
Right.
going to get, and bigger businesses that folks are saying received money that maybe they shouldn't have got. So I just think the whole concept of giving and how that works is something that people are far more. It's top of mind now. And so, first of all, thank you for the
Absolutely.
work that you do at the Seattle Foundation. And if I was a little muddy in that explanation, you can certainly clear that up as we go along, because I want folks who may not exactly know how this process works to just kind of be reassured about what we're talking today. So did I get that right?
Yes, absolutely. And yes, I think what we know is we are in a very uncertain and devastating time. And people really come together. And I think that's one of the most heartening results of the circumstances we find ourselves in, is that people are really trying to figure out, from neighbors delivering food or from people chipping in together to ensure that people can get transported to where they need to do for their essential job, or just donating, safety equipment. And we see it along around the whole community. Everyone's just figuring out all the ways that they can support one another. And we have said all along to the philanthropists that we partner with, now's the time to do more. We know that everyone is impacted. The challenge really is that some people, some families, workers are impacted differently and are impacted worse. And so the COVID-19 response fund that we set up at Seattle Foundation, with now more than 60 partners, is specifically about how do we make sure that the most vulnerable workers and families get access to emergency financial supports and assistance in order to keep a roof over their head, food in their stomach, electricity and heat on, while we try to just figure out what's ahead and how we navigate this together. But we definitely have seen a surge of generosity, and really, Tony, it's going to take even more.
And again, this is something that folks may have heard of it as rapid response, or because the need was
Right.
was urgent. And so a normal granting process is you put out an application, you give folks a couple months or whatever to take a look at it and know that it's out there. Then an application is reviewed. If we were in the midst of doing that right now, then people would not be getting what they need. And we know the results of some of these things, because there's a lot of folks who are still waiting for unemployment.
Yeah.
Even though this is
absolutely.
urgent. And so, again, this is something that, some people are calling it rapid response, and some people are using another names. But the point is to get the money out there as quickly as possible, so that agencies, entities, folks have access to it so that it can respond to critical emergencies. Is it, again, that about right?
You got it. Yeah, that's about right, Tony. And I think, we had some idea in January of 2019, when we had the federal government shutdown. We got a really close and upfront view of so many families and workers were a half paycheck away from becoming homeless. So soon, a year later, as soon as we got really a glimpse of the beginnings of the scale of the crisis and the impact it was going to have on most vulnerable families and workers, we knew that the fund was launched on March 9th. April 1st was just around the corner, when people were going to have to pay rent or mortgage. They would have to continue to think about how do they get food on the table or keep their lights and electricity on, and how they were actually going to get care, healthcare, childcare, home care, if they were essential workers and were going to still required to go to work. And so we made the decision with our fund partners and the Pandemic Community Advisory Group that we needed to move, especially this first round, resources as quickly as possible and not burden and overwhelm an already overwhelmed system. We know this, and when you talk to food banks, you know this, anyone who's on the front line. The immediate demand that first week of March was overwhelming. And so we decided not to, as you noted, in kind of traditional grant making, to host a formal application process. What we collectively did was work with the Pandemic Community Advisory Group, organizations that are at the front lines, fund partners, to identify a group of organizations who already have ways to serve people who struggle to access traditional services, and could do that through culturally, linguistically, and racially responsive and specific programs and services. So in fact, workers and families who were laid off immediately, or gig workers who lost parts of their income streams, knew that there was something that they could count on while we waited for the state and the federal government to develop their emergency packages and relief packages. So we knew there was just some incredible time sensitivity, as you noted, to get the dollars out and not overwhelm the grassroots community leaders that were already overburdened.
And let's talk about this. So how did this happen? Again, we know we kind of know the timeline for the coronavirus. At some point, Seattle Foundation donations came in. Just kind of tell us how that process started and how you began to become engaged with this.
Sure. I think, like all of us, as we were tracking this globally, and then when public health, Seattle, King County started, I think more, kind of visibly talking about the virus and the potential impact. And then right at the end of the end of February, when we saw the reporting of the first death related to coronavirus, we were in immediate conversation with the county executive's office in public health, that we really just saw something on the horizon, especially for many of us who were just watching how at that point, different countries, different regions of countries were being completely shut down. So we knew that we were going to have to move quickly and recognize the importance of standing up a cross-sector partnership of government, philanthropy, business, and community to launch an effort that was going to be able to bring in charitable donations and dollars and move them back out in the community, while we just got a sense of how big this was going to be, how deep this was going to impact us, and how long this was going to last. And so it was important and immediate, because we sit at a number of tables with a range of corporate and foundation partners. We went to them and they came to us, and we were all just in conversation in real time to say, what are we going to do? And, literally within days, we had an initial group of 12 partners and $2.5 million, and launched the fund on March 9th. And our commitment was try to get dollars out as much as possible within the first few weeks. And, today now we have over 60 partners. We have raised over $20 million, and we have granted out over half of those dollars already. And we're preparing for, kind of where the gaps, where we're seeing the gaps in the government public safety nets, as well as other philanthropic efforts, in order to target the next round of funding.
Okay, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but when I first heard about it, it was Amazon gave $5 million kind of for South Lake Union, and that may not have been the start of it. That's certainly when I became first aware of it. Is that how the fund started and it evolved into something bigger, or you're saying that there was already you knew that there was a need in place and you began to look for funders? Just kind of clarify that.
Yeah. Well, it's just, you're in constant conversation with people, and everyone was just starting to get a sense, as school districts were talking about closing, as our largest local employers were starting to talk about moving their employees to all remote. People really did start getting a grasp of how serious this was going to be. So the Amazon's $5 million, that's a separate and dedicated fund that they stood up. They launched for small business emergency relief, specifically for the small businesses that were in proximity to their headquarters. So as they sent their employees to work remotely, they knew it was going to have a ripple effect on all the kind of food carts, the restaurants, the dog walkers, everyone who is in other service and retail. So they launched that fund separately, and after we launched the COVID-19 Response Fund, which is housed at Seattle Foundation, the initial partners were the city and the county, United Way of King County, and Seattle Foundation, and then Alaska Airlines, Amazon, Starbucks, and Microsoft. And then shortly thereafter, Connie and Steve Ballmer immediately stepped up, the Bezos Family Foundation, and now we have over 60 partners that include small businesses, family-owned businesses, large national companies, as well as global corporations.
You're listening to Rainier Avenue Radio.World. It's me, Tony B. This is our special impact of the coronavirus pandemic broadcast on South Seattle and surrounding communities. And Kris, when we started this as a radio station that broadcasts in the interest of South Seattle, that was our main concern, was to make sure that our communities were taken care of, that the voices of our communities were heard, that the narratives of our communities are heard. One thing that we knew early on was that the people who lived in our community were going to be impacted and affected by this coronavirus in ways that ultimately folks may not be aware of yet. And we knew early on that our Asian communities were facing discrimination. We knew early on that there were disparities in our African American and poor and marginalized communities that were ultimately going to cause the impact of this to hit them a lot harder. And now we're starting to get those messages. Now we're starting to see those things coming forward. And as an agency, this is something that no one was really prepared for, at least here. I mean, that's the way it looks. Do y'all have an emergency plan? You know this you do this on a regular basis, the distribution of funds. But when this happened, did you have an emergency plan? Did you have okay, in the event of emergency, this is how we will respond? What was that, and how did it work for you? Or was this, again, at some point you just decided we had to start moving forward and you just started working your way through it?
It's a great question. I wish we had an emergency plan in place. It wasn't the case. What we had in place were some deep relationships in communities most impacted. We had a long legacy of trying to advance racial and economic equity, and we had the benefit and privilege of being in relationship to a number of individuals, philanthropists and institutional philanthropists. So we could, for the most part, what we ended up doing that first week of March is really galvanize all of our learnings from 74 years, and especially, I'd say the last 5, those relationships, that knowledge, and bring it all together in a crisis moment. And I think what we really felt like was essential is putting together a fund that was grounded in a set of values that we would hold true no matter what happened, and that was centering racial and economic equity. To your point exactly, we knew that this crisis would hit communities that are already disproportionately impacted by health, racial, and economic disparities hardest, first and worst. We knew that and wanted to be sure then that everything that we did was around making sure that those disparities and inequities weren't amplified further or made more permanent throughout this crisis. And that's why it was really important for us to move dollars to organizations that are providing and supporting, the unique needs and the unique circumstances for immigrant and refugee communities, for undocumented workers and families, for communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous groups that have been so historically and currently still locked out of so many programs and services and disproportionately impacted on so many different quality of life indicators. And then as well, as you noted, that our Asian communities, brothers and sisters and neighbors, were facing racism, violence, hate crimes in response to the crisis. And we want to be sure we're moving resources where they could safely go to trusted community-based grassroots groups in South Seattle, where they could get the care, could get the support that they needed, knowing that they were, like I said, we've all been impacted, but there's some communities, some workers and families who are impacted most. And so we just really tried to galvanize, use all of our resources and our relationships to gather the dollars and move them as quickly as possible to where they were needed most. We didn't have a track record of it, but we had, an ability to draw on all of those learnings to try to do as best we could by our community, knowing nothing was going to be enough given the enormity of what we're all facing together.
Again, you're listening to Rainier Avenue Radio.world. This is our special impact of the coronavirus pandemic on South Seattle and surrounding communities. Special that we air every Friday. Joining me right now is Kris Hermanns, the Chief Impact Officer, Seattle Foundation. I bet when you first got that title, you probably weren't thinking about an impact that we're having right now. And I do commend Seattle Foundation on stepping up and moving forward and raising money, and folks having the confidence to give the money there, and then moving very quickly to give the money out. And these are questions I just need to ask you, especially as we see what's unfolding now. So the federal government response, and this is not a political thing for me, but the federal government response was a little different. And then, distributing money, whether it be locally through a government system, or states through a government system, and of course through a federal system, is a kind of cumbersome process. Not that there wasn't an effort to get money out there as quickly as possible, but what we're now seeing and we're hearing is that folks who necessarily needed the money didn't get the money, and that we are hearing that folks who got some of the funds on a federal level maybe weren't, and I'm not debating who got it and why they need it, but there are even some folks who are saying, hey, you know what, we're going to give it back. Now, I say that to say, and again, commending you on the effort that you put forward. And when you're doing something quickly like this, it's you got to make decisions. But do you have things in place? And again, when you're giving money to folks that will say, okay, this is how it's going to be accountable. This is how we can tell the community where money was spent, how money was spent, and where resources went. Again, you're just trying to get money out of the door, and it may not be possible to put things in place. But did you have a system? How did you work through a system so that if the question was asked, where did the money go and who did it benefit, you would be prepared in some way to say, here's some things that we know, here's some things that we've garnered from what we've done, here's where we can say who was impacted and how they were impacted. Is there a way for you to know how successful this effort was?
It's a good question, Tony. I think what we've tried to do around the accountability is to be transparent. So we've said all along, as we were going through the process to identify these trusted community groups that were at the front lines, that had programs and services where they could move emergency financial assistance immediately to most vulnerable families and workers, that they've had a track record. And when we announced the grants, we made it very public, and it's on the website, and we have encouraged people who need support to look at that list and go to the area community groups that receive funding so that they can access those services. And we have encouraged donors to give more to each of these groups, and many, many more groups. They have track records, they're trusted in the communities, and we know that the funding we provided was not even near close to the need that they had given the demands for services. So again, we're basing this on a trusted set of relationships. We are asking the grantees to be in touch with us in terms of how, how they're able to move the dollars to support the community, and the ways that they're continuing to adapt in order to be able to meet the growing and evolving need on the community. And we've made a commitment that we weren't going to burden the workers on the front lines with anything that was too complicated or too many kind of reports or anything. So it's on us. We'll be going back to all those grantees to have us share their learnings and insights as well as the growing needs so that we can continue to keep the community that's most impacted front of mind as we plan for the longer term. But we've just tried to be transparent, very visible about where the dollars are coming in and where they're going, so that people, this well, community will hold one another accountable. And so we're learning that every day as people come to us with more requests and more asks of how we continue to do right by the community.
And Kris, again, I appreciate you being here. Given the amount of money that you give, that you're given, and the things that you do, at the end of the day, it puts you in a position where we have to ask you questions about accountability, because we have so many definitions now of what equity means, and different value systems of who's important and where is important. And again, this thing is evolving, and so the landscape might change. And so I think it's important that everybody also knows how to make sure that they are in contact and connect with the people who not only provide services, but at the people at the end of the day who are in need of services. And that's not always an easy match to make. But
absolutely.
I want to give you an opportunity here before we leave for final words, anything that you want to say to our listening audience, to those who are out there who've received services, to those who are out there who, again, in some cases right now are going, how is it possible that I have nothing? I haven't, the hackers are stealing the stimulus checks, and I can't get in on the hotline to get my unemployment, and I hear there's all this money out there. And again, I'm not putting all that out on you, but again, I just want to give you an opportunity
Thanks, Tony,
to respond to it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Tony, this crisis has laid bare all the ways that our society has to do better. We are so fragile, and whether it's around sick leave, health insurance, medical care, access to food, access to affordable housing, being able to have meaningful work and financial stability for your family and community. This crisis has shown that we have to do so much better. And we're not talking about rebuilding and recovering to what was. We have to really talk about reinventing to what can be. That we could have predicted, unfortunately, that that communities that are already experiencing the worst disparities and hit, first by climate change or economic injustices, are Black and Indigenous communities, communities of color generally, and immigrant and refugee communities and undocumented workers. We knew that, and so we have to just make a commitment to one another in the way that we have stepped up now. We have to think about how do we step up differently for the future, knowing that This isn't about rebuilding to what was, because it wasn't equitable, it wasn't fair, and we have disadvantaged so many workers and families in our region that actually threatens the vibrancy for all of us. And so that's really our commitment, is to try to use this momentum, not, to continue to get workers and families what they need to survive right now, but actually to build a society that allows people to thrive differently going forward.
Well, again, Kris, thank you for taking the time to join us for this conversation. Know that you can always use Rainier Avenue Radio as a resource if you want to do a check-in and find out how people are doing in our community and surrounding communities. And it just is what it is. We hope we can check in with you later. And then by the same token, I wouldn't be doing what I'm charged with doing in my community if I wasn't calling and asking questions and trying to get answers to find out things, especially this isn't personal. This is a crisis. And this is
you
just
call
what
me
we're doing.
anytime, Tony B. We appreciate what you're doing for the community. This is important.
Okay. Thank you, Kris, and thanks for joining us.
You've got it. Take care of yourself.
Yep.
Bye now.
You're listening to RainierAvenueRadio.world. We will be back to talk to Carolyn Bick, who essentially kind of broke the story in South Seattle about the testing center in Rainier Beach. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to RainierAvenueRadio.world.
Phil Radio, servicing the Filipino and Filipino Americans all over the world. Phil Radio, streaming live in the internet every Tuesday from 1 o'clock to 2:30 p.m. Seattle, USA time. We are your host, Kuya Bert Kawili, Emma Heron, and
Manny Panganiban.
Phil Radio.
This is your RainierAvenueRadio.world community update on online Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. If you're looking for an AA meeting, find one every day online at aaphonemeetings.org. That's aaphonemeetings.org.
This is Big Poppy, host of Jazz from the Cabinets. Join me each week for a listening tour of the first century of jazz, an eclectic mix of Dixieland, big band, cool jazz, bebop, contemporary jazz, world jazz, all jazz in all forms. That's Jazz from the Cabinets with Big Poppy on Rainier Avenue Radio and on RainierAvenueRadio.world.